The skill programming language provides functions to allow you to easily read ASCII data from text files by opening a file, reading data from the file, and then closing the file when done. The in-file function is used to open a file for input. If the file is opened successfully, then a port to the open file is returned, while nil is returned if the file could not be opened for reading. The file to be opened can either be an absolute path, or a relative path. On the Windows platform, the skill interpreter will automatically convert the /Linux directory separator to a \DOS directory separator, allowing you to easily write platform-independent programs by always using the /file separator. If you wish to use the \file separator, then you must escape the / with the / for the skill interpreter. Relative path names are resolved using the user's skill path. Each directory defined in the user's skill path is searched in order, and the first file with a matching file name will be used. To force a file to be read from the current PCB editor working directory, you can prepend the file name with a /, which will be treated as an absolute path, and the skill path will not be consulted. Let's look at an easy example of reading a set of bowling scores out of a text file, and calculating the average for each bowler. Notice that our input file has a header line at the top, and then nice columns of data with the bowler's name, and then the score for each of the 3 games. We'll define a procedure named bowling average that will accept one argument, the name of the file that contains the bowling scores. We need to open the file for input, so we'll use the in-file function to open our input port, and store it in the variable in port. If the file could not be opened for input, then the in-file function will return a nil, so we'll wrap the rest of the function in a when construct to avoid errors if we try to read from a nil port. In other words, our when block will not run if the file could not be opened. There are many functions for reading data from a file, but the getS function is the most common. The getS function accepts 2 arguments. The second argument is an input port to read from, and the first argument is a symbol or variable to store the string that was read in from the input port. This line will read one line from the input file port stored in port, and save that line as a string in the variable line. When the getS function reaches the end of an input port, it will return nil. This allows us to use a while loop to continue reading lines of an input port until all the lines are exhausted. Now, when we are able to open the input port, we will continuously loop over the lines that are read in, while there are still data in the input port to be read. Back in our input file, we see that there's first a header line that we want to read in, before we start calculating averages. So we will read in one line of the file before we begin our loop, and calculate the averages. Our loop will read a second line from the file, and store it in the variable line. Since our input is nice columns of data, we can use the parseString function to parse the data into individual words. Let's go to the skill interpreter, and open our input file, and read the first line of data with the getS function. This is our header line, so we'll read another line of data, and we can see that this line is a string. The parseString function parses a string in individual words using whitespace characters as separators by default. The parseString function accepts an optional second argument that can be used to define different parsing characters. We now have a list where the first item of the list is the user's name, and the next 3 items in the list are the bowler's scores. Extra variables are cheap, so we'll store the name in each of the scores in variables, and then calculate the average of the scores. Finally, we'll print the bowler's name and the average to standard out. The loop will only run if we're able to open the file, and then the loop will continue to process until every line of the file has been read. When the loop reaches the end of the file and is done, we will close our input file with the close function. Let's save our file and run it and see if it works. Notice that we get an error with the plus function. The parseString function breaks a string into a list of strings, and we are then trying to add strings instead of integers, so we can use the a to I function to convert our strings to integers, so that we can successfully add together, and then divide by 3 to find the average. Now, when we save the file and run the function, we see that we have read lines of data from an input file until the data in the file is exhausted, and then closed our input file, and ended our function.